20th century, an era of extremes, unprecedented technological advances, and unimaginable horrors. 2 world wars devastated the planet, redrawing borders and leaving deep scars on the psyche of humanity. Revolutions swept continents, toppling centuries-old monarchies and empires. Amid this whirlwind of change, radical ideologies gained strength, paving the way for the rise of authoritarian leaders who promised order and stability in times of crisis. In Africa, the process of decolonization, which began after the Second World War, represented a crucial moment. The continent, exploited and subjugated by European powers for centuries, envisioned the independence it longed for. However, the transition to autonomy was neither gradual nor linear. The battles of power left by the former metropolises created fertile ground for political disputes, ethnic conflicts, and the emergence of authoritarian regimes, which often frustrated expectations of freedom and progress. In the heart of East Africa lies Uganda, a country blessed with lush and diverse natural resources, earning it the nickname Pearl of Africa. Crystal clear lakes, snow-capped mountains, dense tropical forests, and vast savannas make up a landscape of unparalleled beauty. But behind this paradisiacal landscape, a dark story was about to unfold. From the 1970s onwards, Uganda would be the scene of one of the most brutal regimes on the continent, under the command of Idi Amin Dada. His trajectory, from humble origins to the exercise of absolute power, is a compelling portrait of the dangers of authoritarianism and the fragility of democratic institutions in a post-colonial context. Amin's story is a warning about how unbridled ambition, violence, and manipulation can lead a country to ruin. Idi Amin Dada was born around 1925, possibly in the Kiboko region of northwestern Uganda, near the border with Sudan. The uncertainty surrounding his date and place of birth reflects his humble origins and the lack of formal records at the time. His ethnicity was Kakwa, a small ethnic group in the region. His father, Andreas Nyabayer, was a member of this tribe and abandoned the family shortly after Amin was born. Amin was raised by his mother, Asaat, a woman who practiced traditional medicine and local religious rituals. The absence of a father and precarious socioeconomic situation left a deep mark on his childhood. Life in Uganda under British rule offered few opportunities for young men like Amin, with limited access to formal education and limited prospects for the future. In 1946, seeking a better life, Amin joined the King's African Rifles, KR, a British colonial military force composed of soldiers recruited from several East African colonies. The KR represented an opportunity for social advancement and financial stability for many young Africans. Amin's robust build, standing nearly 6 feet tall and with an athletic build, set him apart from the start. He quickly demonstrated an aptitude for military life, impressing his superiors with his discipline, physical strength, and loyalty. In the KR, Amin served in a number of operations, including the suppression of the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya during the 1950s. The Mau Mau uprising was a resistance movement against British colonial rule, marked by violent conflict and atrocities on both sides. Amin's experience in this conflict exposed him to the brutality of war and influenced his military tactics and worldview. He gained a reputation as a courageous and efficient soldier, although he was also accused of acts of violence and brutality during this period. His dedication and loyalty led him to a rapid rise through the military ranks. By 1953, he had reached the rank of Sergeant Major, a highly respected rank for an African in the colonial army. During his time in the KR, Amin also established important ties with political figures such as Milton Obote, who would play a key role in Uganda's independence and Amin's political career. This relationship, initially one of partnership, would turn into a rivalry and would be crucial to the events that followed. On October 9, 1962, Uganda gained independence from the United Kingdom, a historic moment that marked the end of decades of colonial rule. Milton Obote, leader of the Uganda People's Congress, UPC, became the country's first prime minister, leading the nation on its first steps towards autonomy. Independence brought with it the promise of a new beginning, self-determination, and building a prosperous future for the Ugandan people. Idi Amin, with his growing reputation in the military, played an important role during the transition period to independence. His loyalty to Obote and his ability to maintain order within the military made him a valuable ally to the new government. In 1964, Amin was appointed deputy commander of the Ugandan army, and in 1966, he rose to the rank of commander, consolidating his power within the military. However, the early years of independent Uganda were marked by significant challenges: ethnic tensions between different groups, internal political disputes, and economic hardship created a climate of instability in the country. Obote, seeking to consolidate his power, implemented controversial policies, such as the Adama Motion, which centralized power in the hands of the central government and weakened Uganda's traditional kingdoms. The once close relationship between Obote and Amin began to deteriorate. Amin, with his growing influence within the army, began to pose a threat to Obote's power. Rumors of corruption and embezzlement of military funds involving Amin reached Obote's ears, increasing distrust between the two. Obote began planning to remove Amin from command of the army, which set off a series of events that culminated in the coup d'etat. In January 1971, while Obote was attending a Commonwealth conference in Singapore, Amin orchestrated a military coup, seizing power in Uganda. On January 25, 1971, the coup was carried out, marking the beginning of one of the darkest periods in Ugandan history. Amin justified the coup by alleging corruption in Obote's government and the need to restore order and stability to the country. With the coup, Amin proclaimed himself president of Uganda, commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and head of state. The country entered a new era marked by repression, violence, and authoritarianism. The rise of Idi Amin Dada to power in Uganda in January 1971 ushered in a period of state terror that left a profound mark on the country's history. Far from being merely an authoritarian government, Amin's regime was characterized by systematic and widespread violence, with the aim of consolidating the dictator's personal power and eliminating any form of opposition, real or imagined. Violence became the main tool of governance, spreading fear and distrust at all levels of Ugandan society. In his first acts after the coup, Amin suspended the constitution, dissolved parliament, and began to govern by presidential decree, concentrating all powers in his hands. He quickly established a cult of personality, using state propaganda to present himself as a strong, messianic leader and savior of the nation. At the same time, any dissenting voice was brutally silenced. The backbone of the regime of terror was made up of several security agencies, most notably the infamous State Research Bureau, SRB. This secret police operated with almost unlimited powers, becoming synonymous with torture, enforced disappearances, and extrajudicial executions. SRB agents acted with total impunity, carrying out broad daylight kidnappings, breaking into homes without a warrant, and carrying out acts of unimaginable physical and psychological violence. In addition to the SRB, other paramilitary organizations and units of the army itself also actively participated in the repression, creating a complex and comprehensive network of terror that extended throughout Uganda. The regime's victims were diverse and covered different sectors of society. Political opponents, real or potential, were the primary targets, but the violence also affected intellectuals, journalists, religious leaders, students, business people, and members of specific ethnic groups, such as the Akoli and Lango, who were viewed with suspicion by the regime. Amin's paranoia, which intensified over time, led him to suspect even his closest allies, resulting in purges within the army and the government itself. Accusations of conspiracy, treason, subversion, and disloyalty were used as justification for arbitrary arrests, cruel torture, and summary executions, often without any trial. The torture methods employed by the SRB and other agencies were extremely cruel, leaving deep physical and psychological scars on the victims. Survivors' accounts describe a gruesome repertoire of violence, including brutal beatings, electric shocks applied to various parts of the body, mutilation, burning, nail extraction, simulated drowning, rape, and other forms of sexual violence, as well as psychological torture, such as simulated executions and threats against family members. Prisons became veritable centers of horror, with overcrowded cells, unsanitary conditions, poor hygiene, and poor food, in addition to the degrading treatment imposed on inmates. The bodies of victims were often abandoned in public places, thrown into rivers, forests, or buried in mass graves, as a macabre way of spreading terror and intimidating the population, making clear the fate of those who dared to challenge the regime. Violence was not confined to urban centers. Amin's regime also carried out systematic massacres in rural areas, with the aim of repressing ethnic communities that it considered to be hostile. The northern region of Uganda, inhabited mainly by the Akoli and Lango people, suffered particularly from state violence. Large-scale massacres were carried out by soldiers and militias allied with the regime, resulting in the deaths of thousands of innocent civilians, including women, children, and the elderly. These actions aimed not only to eliminate opponents, but also to create a climate of terror and subjugation in rural communities. In addition to physical violence and murder, Amin's regime implemented a policy of dispossession and expulsion of minorities, most notably the expulsion of Asians in 1972. Around 80,000 people, mainly of Indian and Pakistani origin, who had lived in Uganda for generations, were expelled from the country on charges of controlling the economy and exploiting the local population. This arbitrary and discriminatory measure, in addition to causing a mass exodus and causing serious damage to the Ugandan economy, represented an act of racism and xenophobia. The properties and businesses of Asians were confiscated and distributed among supporters of the regime, which contributed to increased corruption, inflation, and economic instability. The impact of Idi Amin's regime of terror on Ugandan society was devastating and multifaceted. It is estimated that hundreds of thousands of people were killed, tortured, or disappeared during the period. The country's economy collapsed, public institutions were corroded by widespread corruption, and the social fabric was deeply shaken. The trauma of violence, the loss of life, and destruction of family and community structures left deep scars that persist in Ugandan society to this day. The lack of accountability for crimes committed during Amin's regime and the absence of an adequate transitional justice process have made it difficult to overcome this traumatic past and continue to impact the lives of Ugandans. The legacy of Amin's terror serves as a constant warning about the dangers of authoritarianism, state violence, the suppression of human rights, and the importance of building just and democratic societies. Idi Amin's regime in Uganda was not limited to brutal internal repression. His administration was also marked by an erratic foreign policy and a series of eccentricities that projected him onto the international stage, often in a caricature light, in stark contrast to the violence that ravaged the country. This combination of brutality and extravagance contributed to Amin's complex and multifaceted image. Amin's relentless pursuit of attention and his cultivation of an image as a strong and unpredictable leader were defining characteristics of Amin. His self-proclaimed titles, such as His Excellency President for Life Marshal Idi Amin Dada, Lord of all the beasts of the earth and fishes of the seas, and conqueror of the British Empire and Africa in general, and Uganda in particular, were not mere jokes. They reflected a deep-seated megalomania and a detachment from reality, serving as a tool of self-promotion and intimidation, both for his domestic audience and for the international community. The constant repetition of these titles in speeches and official statements reinforced this image. On the international stage, Amin adopted a radical nationalist and anti-imperialist stance, directing much of his rhetoric against the United Kingdom, the former colonial power. The expulsion of Asians from Uganda in 1972, on the grounds that they controlled the economy and exploited the local population, was emblematic of this stance. The measure, which affected some 80,000 people, generated strong international condemnation, damaging Uganda's relations with several countries, including the United Kingdom, India, and other Commonwealth nations. The confiscation of Asian assets and their redistribution among supporters of the regime aggravated the situation, contributing to economic chaos and increased corruption. Amin's relations with other African countries were complex and varied throughout his rule. Initially, he received support from some African leaders who saw him as a nationalist who challenged neocolonialism. However, his violent actions and instability soon isolated him on the continent. His relations with Tanzania, in particular, were extremely tense, culminating in the Uganda-Tanzania War in 1978. Ugandan military incursions into Tanzanian territory and Amin's bellicose statements led to Tanzanian intervention with the support of Ugandan exiles, which resulted in the fall of his regime in 1979. Amin also sought support from other blocs, such as the Communist Bloc, establishing relations with the Soviet Union and Muammar Gaddafi's Libya, from which he received military and financial support. He also sought rapprochement with Arab countries, mainly for economic and religious reasons. Since Amin had converted to Islam, his eccentricities and bizarre behavior were a constant. Amin often appeared in public in extravagant military uniforms, adorned with numerous medals and decorations, many of them self-awarded. His speeches were marked by bombastic statements, threats to foreign leaders, and comments considered bizarre. Some notable examples include telegrams to world leaders. Amin sent unusual telegrams to leaders such as Queen Elizabeth II, U.S. President Jimmy Carter, and UN Secretary General Kurt Waldheim, with messages ranging from outrageous proposals to insults and declarations of admiration. Eccentric proposals. He proposed moving the UN headquarters to Kampala, offered to mediate in complex international conflicts such as the Vietnam War, and even proclaimed himself King of Scotland. Theatrical behavior. Amin was known for his public performances, including simulated boxing matches, displays of physical strength, and other theatrical behaviors that sought to reinforce his image as a strong and powerful man. Controversial statements. Amin made bizarre and contradictory statements, including claims that he was a cannibal and that he ate human flesh, which contributed to his image as a cruel and insane dictator. It is crucial to emphasize that these eccentricities, while they have generated fascination and curiosity in the international media, should not obscure the brutality of his regime. The caricatured image of Amin as an eccentric and humorous dictator has often minimized the gravity of the human rights violations and the suffering inflicted on the Ugandan population. The atrocities committed under his rule cannot be trivialized or reduced to mere brief and amusing narratives. Agera entre Uganda e Tanzania, 1978 to 1979. Marku ofim do brutal regime de Idi Amin Dada. Lunge de ser movimento isolado, o conflito foi o climax de anos de tensões latentes e uma consequência direta de instabilidade interna de Uganda e da política externa errática de Amin. As raízes do conflito remontam a antes mesmo do ascenso de Amin ao poder em 1971. O presidente tanzaniano Julius Nyerere, líder socialista e pan-africanista, seguia uma política de apoio a movimentos de libertação e oposição a regimes autoritários na África Austral. Essa postura incluía o acolhimento de exilados políticos, entre eles Milton Obote, o presidente ugandense deposto por Amin. Essa hospitalidade oferecida a Obote e outros opositores ugandenses irritava profundamente Amin, que vai Nyerere como inimigo e conspirador. As relações entre os dois países se deterioram ao longo da década de 1970, marcadas por críticas mútuas de interferência em assuntos internos, disputas de fronteira e incidentes armados de baixa intensidade. Amin acusava a Tanzania de abrigar e treinar guerrilheiros ugandeses que planejavam derrubá-lo, enquanto Nyerere criticava abertamente as violações dos direitos humanos, a violência estatal e os chaos econômico promovidos pelo regime de Amin. Em outubro de 1978, a situação escalou dramaticamente. Tropas ugandenses invadiram a região do Rio Kagera, no norte de Tanzania, alegando uma suposta incursão tanzaniana em território ugandense. Essa alegação nunca foi comprovada e em Viseu foi amplamente vista como ato de agressão neoprovocado. As forças ugandenses ocuparam uma faixa de território tanzaniano, saqueando aldeias, cometendo atrocidades contra a população civil e causando grande destruição. A Tanzania, apesar de ter sido pega de surpresa pela escalada em Viseu, responde com firmeza. Nyerere mobilizou o Exército Popular de Tanzania, TPDF, exército relativamente bem treinado e disciplinado, e declara guerra a Uganda. A resposta tanzaniana foi apoiada por grande parte da comunidade internacional, que condenava o regime de Amin. Feito crucial na guerra foi a formação de Frente Nacional de Libertação de Uganda, UNLF. A UNLF era uma colisão de grupos de oposição ugandenses, incluindo facos lidos Milton Obote e lideranças emergentes como Yoweri Museveni. A UNLF luta ao lado do TPDF, fornecendo conhecimento do terreno, apoio logístico e competentes. A participação da UNLF transforma a guerra não apenas em conflito entre dois países, mas também em uma guerra civil ugandense. A guerra propriamente dita foi relativamente rápida. O TPDF, superior em treinamento e equipamento, avança rapidamente em território ugandense, encontrando pouca resistência organizada. O exército ugandense, enfraquecido por anos de corrupção majesto, expurgos internos e falta de treinamento adequado. Esse mostra incapaz de deter o avanço tanzaniano. A Líbia de Muammar Gaddafi, apoio de Amin, enviou tropas em apoio ao regime ugandense. No entanto, a intervenção líbia foi limitada e ineficaz, não conseguindo reverter o curso de guerra. As tropas líbias, mal preparadas para o tipo de combate na região, sofreram passadas baixas e foram rapidamente derrotadas. Em abril de 1979, as forças tanzanianas e da UNLF capturaram Kampala, a capital de Uganda. Amin fugiu do país, inicialmente para a Líbia, onde recebeu asilo de Gaddafi, e posteriormente para a Arábia Saudita, onde viveu em exílio até sua morte em 2003. Amin's downfall marked the end of a period of terror and violence in Uganda, but did not bring immediate stability. The country was plunged into a period of political turmoil, with successive transitional governments and internal conflicts between different political factions and ethnic groups. The war with Tanzania left a legacy of destruction, human losses, and deep psychological trauma in Ugandan society. In the geopolitical context, the war took place in a Cold War context, with Tanzania aligned with the Socialist Bloc, and Amin seeking support both in the Communist Bloc and in Arab countries. The Libyan intervention, for example, can be seen as an attempt by Gaddafi to expand his influence in Africa. The role of the UNLF. The UNLF played a crucial role in the war, providing a Ugandan face to the Tanzanian intervention and legitimizing Amin's overthrow. The presence of figures such as Obote and Museveni in the UNLF also influenced the Ugandan political landscape in the following decades. The Libyan intervention. Gaddafi's intervention was motivated by ideological and economic ties with Amin, as well as expansionist ambitions in Africa. The defeat of Libyan troops in the war represented a setback for Gaddafi's foreign policy. The consequences of the war. The war had devastating consequences for Uganda, including the destruction of infrastructure, the collapse of the economy, and the loss of thousands of lives. The country also faced a long period of political instability and violence after the war. Amin's exile. Amin lived in relative tranquility in Saudi Arabia with the support of the Saudi government. He was never held accountable for the crimes committed during his regime. The regime of Idi Amin Dada represents a deeply dark chapter in Uganda's history, a period marked by brutal violence, relentless repression, and an economic collapse that left deep scars on Ugandan society. Amin's legacy goes beyond casualty figures and reports of atrocities. It manifests itself in collective trauma, social divisions, and persistent challenges that the country faces to this day. The memory of this dark period serves as a constant reminder of the dangers inherent in unbridled authoritarianism, the concentration of power in the hands of a single individual, and the suppression of fundamental human rights. The case of Uganda under Amin demonstrates how nationalist and populist rhetoric, combined with state violence, can lead to the ruin of a nation. The impact of Amin's regime on Uganda was multifaceted and devastating. Human losses and trauma. It is estimated that hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives during Amin's regime, victims of summary executions, torture, enforced disappearances, and generalized violence. The psychological trauma caused by these events affected generations of Ugandans, leaving deep scars on society. Economic collapse. Amin's disastrous economic policies, including the expulsion of Asians from Uganda and the nationalization of businesses, led to the collapse of the country's economy. Inflation soared, shortages of basic goods became widespread, and corruption eroded state institutions. Social divisions. Amin's regime exacerbated ethnic and religious tensions in Uganda, creating deep divisions in society. Targeted violence against certain ethnic and religious groups created a climate of fear and distrust that persists to this day. Destruction of institutions. Amin dismantled Uganda's democratic institutions, eroded the justice system, and militarized the state. The culture of impunity and lack of accountability for crimes committed during his regime weakened the rule of law and made it difficult to build a just and equitable society. Impact on international image. Amin's regime tarnished Uganda's image in the eyes of the international community, isolating the country diplomatically and damaging its relations with other nations. Uganda's reputation as an unstable and violent country took a long time to overcome. The importance of historical memory in this context is crucial. Remembering the horrors of Amin's regime is not just about revisiting the past, but about learning from mistakes and preventing them from happening again. Historical memory serves as an antidote to denial, revisionism, and the trivialization of violence. It strengthens civic consciousness, promotes respect for human rights, and encourages the building of a more just and democratic society. Uganda, since the fall of Amin, has come a long way towards reconstruction and reconciliation. The country has faced significant challenges, including internal conflicts, political instability, and economic hardship. However, there have been important advances in consolidating democracy, promoting economic development, and seeking justice for past victims. Idi Amin's legacy remains a grim reminder of the dangers of authoritarianism and the importance of constant vigilance in defending human rights and democracy. The memory of this tragic period should serve as a beacon, guiding Uganda and other nations toward a more just, peaceful, and prosperous future.